let me make some very brief remarks in the form of a short series of points. Point number one, which is a point of agreement with Robert Kagan. Whatever we've learned over the past 25 years, I think we've learned that there is no end of history. And to be more precise, there is no magical, invisible hand, divine or human, that is moving us in the direction of ever-increasing democracy. There is a distinction between liberalism, which is a body of ideals, and progressivism, which is a set of assumptions about the direction of history. You can be a liberal without being a progressive, and you can be a progressive without being a liberal. That's a very important lesson that we've had to relearn the hard way. Point number two of agreement with Bob Kagan: power matters. But power is not the only thing that matters. America's protective canopy after World War II had two crucial ingredients. Ingredient number one was military power and a credible commitment to use it. But commitment number two was to a body of ideals. And, as a teacher of mine once said, the sight of justice without a sword is a sorry sight. And ideals without power in back of them are also a sorry sight. And for a long period, we had both. I will say as an editorial matter that if you fight unnecessary wars, it becomes harder to fight necessary wars. If you fight wars without end, it becomes more difficult to engage in the kinds of limited military actions that are so often necessary to defend democracy. The third point I want to make is that liberal democracy, as it has flourished and grown since the end of the Second World War, now faces two kinds of threats. Threat number one is external. And if you look at Europe, let's take Europe. There is a Russian threat. There is a Chinese threat that is stealthier but not to be underestimated. And there is also pressure from the failed states and the failed non-states, both of the Middle East and of sub-Saharan Africa. And if you think Europe has faced a refugee crisis, just wait until sub-Saharan Africa becomes uninhabitable, which it's in the process of becoming. What's going to happen then? You have a continent with countries, Europe, with countries that are not only growing in population, but in a number of cases are declining in population. And then you have exploding populations in areas that are becoming uninhabitable. What happens then? But there are also internal threats to democracy. Poor economic performance, overreach. The European Union bet too much on internationalism and forgot about the forces of nationalism. It bet too much on the ideas of multiculturalism and underestimated the force of the power of cultural particularity. And those misjudgments and overreaches contributed, in my view, which I express at somewhat greater length in my book, to the rise of illiberal populism in Europe, but alas, not only in Europe. And I guess to tie off this point, I would say that we assume that nationalism is one thing, liberalism is another, and that liberal nationalism is an oxymoron. That is false. It's false conceptually and it's false historically. Liberal nationalism was the original form of liberalism. And in my judgment, it is just as viable a form of liberal democracy as liberal internationalism. And so we should not go overboard in our denigration of nationalism. My fourth and final point has to do with the illustrative nature of Ambassador Eisen's chosen subject. let us look at what used to be Czechoslovakia. And what do we see? Well, we found that the Velvet Revolution was followed very quickly by the Velvet Divorce. The Czechs and the Slovaks, although they're not all that different, suffer from what the Freudians call the narcissism of little differences. They could not live together, right? The force of nationalism was too strong for Czechoslovakia. At least the separation was peaceful, but let us not forget that these two nations separated. And secondly, what has happened to the country whose first post-communist president was Václav Havel? His office is now occupied by Miloš Zeman, who has publicly cited Xi Jinping as a model of effective governance and has called the conflict in Ukraine a civil war. Right? What a fall there was, my countrymen. And so the Czech Republic is exemplary, alas, in many, perhaps too many respects. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, I'm going to invite Linda Wertheimer and my honorary book family to come to the stage now. And Letty, why don't you say where you want everyone, please?
We know where our seats are.
Do we?
You're at the end.
I'm totally clueless. I confess.
You're where you were. She's at the end.
I'm down there?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, thank you.
Right next to me. This is Alex. Let's put Alexander here.
Yeah, Alexander, you sit next to me. Alexander, come down here. I'll help with the German if necessary.
This is like Chinese.
If you think I'm long-winded in English, wait till you hear me in German.
Okay, great.
And I'll invite those who are standing. We now have the speakers' seats in the front and a few other fill-ins, so please do come and have a seat.
Now, are we going to speak in the order in which we are sitting?
Whatever order you prefer.
That's fine. I'm Linda Wertheimer, and I come to you from, where is
It's the button.
there, okay. I'm Linda Wertheimer. I am the, I guess, longest serving person at National Public Radio, still on the air. And it's been a wonderful adventure, and one of the things that happens is that people like Norm call me up and give me an opportunity to do something like this, which is quite a wonderful thing to be able to do. I just want to mention the people who we're talking to today, just so you get the sense of who they are. Now, there was a man named Toussaint, Rudolph Toussaint, right? Toussaint, who was the German who took command. He was running essentially Prague, and he lived in the palace. And his great-grandson, grandson, is here today, and it is his. He is the closest, one of the closest. I mean, all of the interesting thing about this panel is that everybody does reach back to those extraordinary days between the interwar period. And Alexander, this is Alexander Toussaint, and we'll talk to him in a minute. Lorraine, excuse me, Lorraine Sherlock is the granddaughter of the ambassador Lawrence Steinhardt, who was the first post-war ambassador, and Charlie Black, who's right here in the middle. Charlie Black is the son of Shirley Temple Black, who was the ambassador. Well, she served actually for a relatively, through a relatively interesting period of time. And we'll get to that. And then we have Mark, what have I got? You're in my notes. Mark Robinson. He has had a very, very distinguished career at Yale. He is a professor of, among other things, he teaches about films and plays, and we keep hearing about this fabulous building, that the palace. If everything had turned out as Otto intended it to turn out, he would be living in the palace. It would be his palace. But we Americans basically got hold of it and never gave it back. So let's just start in a kind of I suppose in a way we're starting chronologically with Mark Robinson. The Petchik Palace was built between the wars by a Czech family who were immensely rich. Notably, as Europe was struggling to rebuild in the aftermath of the First World War, the Petchik family had coal, which was huge, and it made them very, very rich. Otto, the builder of the palace, spent huge amounts of money buying, among other things, we felt that it was a beautiful big building. It would be a beautiful big building, but it needed beautiful big trees. So he bought old trees, huge old trees, and had them dug up and roots bound and wrapped and loaded onto boxcars where they had to lie down because they were such big trees, and taken to plant in his garden. And of course, the most recent occupant of that house and person who walked in that garden was our own Norm Eisen. And I was privileged to see it myself when we went to Prague and went to visit Norm. It was the garden, Norm says, was Gallic, British, and Teutonic all at once. It was a landscape created for a linguistically German, legally Czech, culturally European Jew. And Mark Robinson's career at Yale has reflected his antecedents' interest in the arts. So let me just ask you, first of all, when did you first see the Petchik Palace?
I first went in 1986. I was living in Poland at the time and decided to make up for my mother's indifference and inability to visit and go to see it and report back. And then I went again 2 other times in the late 80s and early 90s.
What do you remember? Do you remember hearing about it in your family? Was it something in your family lore that you talked about?
Not at all.
Really?
In fact, that was what planted the seed, the desire to make up for that, to find out everything that either my grandfather chose not to talk about or my mother simply didn't know. My mother actually was the youngest of the 54 people who went to that Eucharistic Congress in Budapest. She was born 6 weeks before the family went into exile. But she has no idea, she had no idea where she was during the first months of her life, and didn't know actually who took care of her, because her mother, my grandfather's wife, decided to stay behind with the other men in the family and close up the business. So it was a big mystery, and again, my mother, I think respecting her father's wish not to open up that very painful period, simply didn't ask any questions. But nothing was stopping me from doing that. So I did, and I went, and I kept asking.
But you didn't just go as a tourist and wander around. You did a tremendous amount of research. You interviewed everybody that you could find who was alive, who had been there for the great moments of the palace.
That's right. My grandfather was obviously still alive, and his 3 sisters were still with us. And while my grandfather was very reticent about the period, his sisters were actually eager to share the information and the memories that they had living there as children. In my grandfather's case, actually, he simply erased his past, not only because the experience of exile was painful, but I think that in moving to New York in the 30s, he encountered a great deal of anti-Semitism and chose to kind of blanket over that period. So he was a kind of, and he did speak about this, not really having any identity, not feeling any kind of closeness to his Jewish identity, distant from his Czech identity, as many German-speaking members of the Prague community were. And I wanted some kind of personality there, so I kind of filled it in outline form by speaking to his siblings and also to other Petcheks. It's a very vast family, some of whom don't speak to each other. My grandmother once unironically referred to the Jewish Petcheks as though she had nothing in common with them.
One of the people that you were incredibly generous, I understand from Norm, to share your research with him. You were engaged in filling in that. You were filling in that outline, weren't you, Norm? The outline that he created when he did all this research, which you got to see and to use.
Well, I have to thank Mark and all of my book family who are here for their generosity. I should abuse my NPR privileges further to do just a few quick words. My research assistants, Kelsey and Andrew, who helped so much on this book and lived the book with me. My editor, Domenica Aliotto, who insisted I write about my mother instead of myself in this book. The other members of the extended family who are here, my Brookings colleagues who are here, so many people in this room, particularly who've stayed behind now for the gossip, who were a part of this book. Mark, I'm so appreciative to you, but really to everybody on here. When I started writing the book, Linda, I went to seek advice from a more experienced author, Michael Lewis, because I realized I'd gotten myself into a bit of a pickle. I've known Michael for many years. I had sold Domenica this proposal and received my advance when I realized I had virtually none of the information I needed to deliver on what I had contractually obligated myself to do with Crown. And so I went and Michael informed me that writing a book is actually, diplomacy is excellent training because you need to get people to talk to you, something you're very good at. And so I went to see all of the people you see up on stage, and over a period of time, we developed a friendship and a trust. I'm very gratified that family, I haven't heard a single complaint and only praise. So I know my adopted book family well enough to know that you'd tell me if I erred. So I feel good about that. And Mark was so generous because I gradually worked my way over to him. And then when I met him, I discovered that for Otto and Martha and Vicky Petchek and the two twins, Rita and Eva, and the two twins, and Eva, who was called the third twin. for the 4 children and the parents, that Mark had the mother lode because he had interviewed everyone when they were alive. And he had pictures and documents, but those interviews just really enabled me to get inside the heads of people. I didn't use everything because the children had some reservations, different. The children of the children had different, and the grandchildren of the children had some reservations, but there was ample material, even avoiding the reservations, to be able to tell the story. And the same thing was true with each of my other colleagues on the panel.
One of the things I guess that we all, that I certainly wondered about is that the palace is a palace. I mean, it is an extraordinary building. You walk into it and it has the sense, because it has these long curved corridors that curve sharply enough that you don't see the end of them. It feels as though it just goes on and on and on, and it is huge. But the thing, and it's very, very ornate and very beautiful. And one of the things I learned in this book was that after the Petchak family fled without most of their possessions, everything was still there, that the German army appropriated all the fur coats. And there must have been dozens of them, huge numbers of beautiful outfits and handbags and shoes and whatnot from the closets of the women in the family. And I was thinking, what an odd thing it is that as I say, you have had a very distinguished career. You're a professor of, how do we say, dramaturgy, theater studies at Yale. Everybody, I mean, a very interesting life. But when you read about all of this stuff and your great-grandparents were so rich, did you ever just have a kind of little twinge that...
Yes, I probably should have said that envy was what really prompted my great curiosity in the family, real estate envy. But I would say even more than the beauty of the building or the various luxury items that were confiscated were the far more personal things that remained in the house. Really everything that the family couldn't bring with them immediately or have shipped out in small packages later remained in the house. One of my great aunts describes the day before going to that train being told by her mother to pack one suitcase and trying to decide what she'd bring with her. And she decided to bring her set of Temple Shakespeare and some theater programs that she loved. Another sister decided to bring some dresses, just spring dresses, nothing for various other climates. And so when I did go to visit the house, I was asked actually by one of my great aunts if I would go to the music room and look in the cabinets because her piano scores, she was a wonderful pianist and teacher of piano, were all still there. And indeed they were, with her own handwritten notations on them. One of the books in the library was in English, a book on American banking methods, and it had in Otto's handwriting the German translations of the English words that he didn't know. So those things actually were far more of a kindling spark in my then later obsessive curiosity about the history.
Now, when you're... I did it again. Didn't I? We have these engineers at NPR. They turn your microphone on. I'm used to somebody else doing that. The thing that one of the things that was fascinating about the story is, as time passes and the next person comes in, and that was the Toussaint, your ancestor, who was a general, yes, in the German army, not a member of the Nazi Party, but apparently very accomplished military man, who came into the palace kind of in much the same way, and I thought this was very interesting, that the period between the wars, when the palace was built, the Peshek family, it was begun in 1924, Otto died in 1934, and in 1938, the Peshek family left Prague, and in 1941, Rudolf Toussaint arrived in Prague, arrived at the palace. Now, he had a very difficult set of negotiations to carry out, as indeed did the many of the people who followed into the palace. Getting hold of the palace turned out to be quite a difficult thing to do. German soldiers were living in it. They had wrecked parts of the place. They had carried off or sold many of the treasures in the place. But he saw that there was so much still there that he felt he could protect it. And that, I think, that was an extraordinary thing, to try to get hold of it and protect it. So let me ask you the same first question. Have you been to the palace? What was your impression of it?
Yes, I went with Norman first time to the palace.
The first time was visiting with Norm.
Yes.
What did you think of it?
From the first moment, I saw how beautiful the palace is, and then I understood how strange it would have been for my grandparents during the war. They were living in a beautiful palace, but surrounded by terror outside its walls. I could see how the beauty of the palace was a part of my grandfather's prison.
A part of his prison. That you mean that he had? It's an interesting way to put it. Did you hear about it when you were a child? Did your family talk about the Peshek Palace?
My grandfather passed away when I was 5, so he never personally told me anything about the war or the palace. My grandmother rarely spoke about either. Everything was too painful. Sometimes, when I was walking with her in Munich and asked her about the war, she would talk about it. Most of the things I know about the war and the palace, I know from my father. He was 22 when he was visiting the palace, and he told me about playing chess there with my grandfather. As he had been fighting on the front lines in Russia, life in the palace was much better, so he made the best out of his short home visit.
Now, his father, the general.
Linda.
I just can't. I'm sorry. His father, the general, did have the experience on more than one occasion of hearing that his son had been killed or that he had been taken prisoner, and he didn't know. So these were obviously very precious times when Rolf, was it the son's name?
Rolf is my father, yeah.
When Rolf was able to come and see his parents, and it didn't happen very often. Now, one of the things that is extremely interesting to me is that your life has been a very different sort of life. You didn't follow your family into a military career. Instead, you were trained as a theologian, ordained as a deacon in the Catholic Church. And you work with Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity. Now, could you just talk to us about why you went in this direction?
I immediately after I graduated high school, I realized that a horrible regime change is always possible. And because of this, I decided not to go to the military, even though it was obligatory this time. My father supported my decision. So I went straight into studying law at university in Munich. When I was a teenager, I didn't believe in God. My father had left the church after the war, and my family, boarding school, and city were mostly extremely liberal and agnostic. But then, while studying law, I felt a call to study theology and read the scriptures, inspired in part by a book that I found while I was traveling in Australia called Jesus More Than a Carpenter. Studying Old Hebrew felt good because reading the original language made me feel closer to the time and the events. Once I finished studying theology in university in 1998, my father died and I began to work with Mother Teresa's charity. Then, after I married and survived cancer, I became an ordained deacon, which I do in my personal time. Throughout my life, the more I read the scripture and prayed, the greater my faith became. But on one hand, I still feel like a poor sinner, maybe like everyone else. But on the other hand, I feel saved through faith as God's child. Maybe my translation is difficult to understand, but I have tried my best.
Can I ask, because I'm privileged to have Alexander as my friend, and the experience of the two of us walking through that house was absolutely extraordinary, I think, for us both. Why don't you tell them who your Hebrew teacher is and who you study the Hebrew Bible with? Your best friend.
Yes, my best friend. It's my best friend, Professor Rechenmacher from Würzburg.
And who is he, Alexander?
Yeah, my best friend, he is a priest and he knows 10 old Semitic languages, and I was learning Hebrew from him mostly. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary series. I mean, I just found this as we heard from Norm. The stories make everything come alive in a really quite a dramatic and interesting way. Now, the next person to occupy the palace was Lawrence Steinhardt. He was the ambassador. He was involved in politics. He helped elect Franklin Roosevelt in 1932. He arrived in Prague in 1945. He was a man that Norm noted in the book, had decades of practice in saving the day. And the idea was that as the country, and of course Prague, were poised on the brink of every dreadful thing that could happen in the wake of the war, it was his job to prevent the worst from happening and to encourage the development of democracy and so forth. His writ was huge to maintain the possibility of democracy, to keep the Russians from taking over. And then in his spare time, sort of as a hobby, he decided he would save the palace. The Russians apparently had been far worse to the palace than the Germans had been. The Toussaint family had preserved much of it and preserved most of its treasure. But the Russians did things like roll a grand piano down the grand staircase, which hardly worked at all. Made a couple of huge dents in the walls along the way. not to mention, of course, completely wrecking the piano. He was living in something which passed for a palace, but apparently was very close to uninhabitable. And he had a very difficult time trying to get the State Department to allow him to find a way to rent the palace, buy the palace, get the palace somehow under American control. And that's what he did. He apparently was a ferocious anti-communist, and in his last months in Prague, he ran out of the Petrek Palace a kind of underground railroad, getting people out as the Russians were coming in. Now, you are his granddaughter? And Lorraine Sherlock has, in some way, I suppose, moved in a similar direction to her father in that she's a savior of treasures as well.
Oh.
Works with antiques, and as a person who she understands the value of this she serves the appraisal needs of individuals, organizations, and institutions in Washington here and in the Mid-Atlantic region. So, have you seen the palace?
Yes, I was privileged to see it through my own eyes and through the eyes of my mother, who lived there from 45 to 48. In 1996, the trip was arranged through the auspices of my cousin sitting in the audience, Peter Rosenblatt, who knew the ambassador at the time, Janon Walker. And so it was an honor to see it, and certainly from the aesthetic standpoint that runs genetically through my family, it's an astounding establishment. The vision of one man and optimism, and it's just marvelous to see.
Do you know how your grandfather was so attracted to it?
Well, there's optimism, then there's pragmatism. The living facilities at the time of his arrival were very compromised. So the chancellery basically was an office complex and a rabbit warren of offices. And I remember my mother saying that you'd be dressing for an event you had to go to, and somebody would open a door and walk right through because they were cohabitating in the chancellery. It was necessary to find something a little bit more appropriate to live in with some privacy. So there was a motivating factor there, really a motivating factor. But I think when my grandfather first saw the Petrek Palace, it harkened back to in some ways, to a certain extent, the background in which he grew up, as well as the historical aspect of this magnificent building. And in seeing it with my mother in 1996, I had one series of impressions, some of which have already been stated. But my mother, who had left the palace in 1948 at the age of 21, we stepped with Ambassador Walker into the ballroom, which, for those of you who understand, Czech glass is magnificent. The chandeliers are superb. And my mother said very quietly, the last time I was in this room, I was 21 years old, and I was dancing at my 21st birthday party under these chandeliers. And I looked at my mother's face, and 60 years of age just washed away. The house has that kind of effect on you. I don't know how else to express that.
One of the stories that your grandfather told was
I think it automatically turns off
that is what it does.
the
yes.
genies of engineering. It's
So maybe I should
it's
just
your
keep
payback,
my
all the
thumb
karma, all those years of being coddled by
You're
engineers.
Right. You're right. Your grandfather described a scene which was just amazing. He said, all of the sort of the old saw about location, 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 of course. The Patrick Palace is on rising ground above the city. You have extraordinary views, especially from the upstairs rooms of this spread. It has huge gardens that are beautiful now. But what Mr. Steinhardt found was, he said that the lawn in the back glittered like diamonds. You want to tell the rest of the story?
Well, in between the, thank you. We're technically challenged up here. In between the departure of General Toussaint's family and the arrival of the Steinhardt family, there was a period of time when Russian Soviet troops occupied the house. And Norm has spoken very glowingly about Podgorny, who was the caretaker through this whole line of history. And he watched as these resident military would take the fine china and throw it up into the air and skeet shoot, and the glassware and the bottles of wine. And so you ended up with a lot of destruction. The chandeliers in the dining room were shot at and shot up. And so when my grandfather arrived, this was the condition he found.
But he fixed it. He cleaned it up.
Well, it sure did. Ordered all the tulips, just got to work. And raised the flagpole, I might add. Put the American flagpole up very high. I mean, his mission statement was to bring the presence of democracy to the forefront in Czechoslovakia at the time. And so up went the flagpole and up went the flag very high. Symbolic.
The most modern occupant of the building, apart from Norm, was Shirley Temple Black. Shirley Temple Black was, as you all know, Shirley Temple in her early life. She first saw the palace in 1968. Now, those of us who are living with young people who talk about what a terrible, terrible time we have had in the last couple of years in this country, I always tell them, you should have been here in 1968. 1968 was a terrible year all over the world, I think. Anyway, that she was there in 1968. She saw riots. She escaped from the city in an extraordinary fashion. When the Soviets drove their tanks into Prague, this was. 21 years later, she came back to the palace as the ambassador appointed by George H.W. Bush. Now, none of us, I think, would have thought of Shirley Temple as an ambassador unless she were just, there to sort of shake her tiny little hands with famous people and completely charm them, which she certainly did all her life. But she turns out to have been one tough cookie. Now, tell us what you want to tell the story about your mother and her motorcade leaving Prague.
I guess you're referring to the 1968 exit.
Yes.
That was she was very pleased to get out. She had a couple of very tough days. She found herself in a limousine at the front of a couple of hundred car cavalcade heading out of Prague and heading to the West German border. And she was in actually the lead car, and there was a car following us, an embassy station wagon with the American flag on it. She told me that as they drove along, people would rush past the soldiers that were along the line and kiss the flag and rush back in. It was a very, very tough time. But at some point, she was in the passenger seat of the front of the car, and the driver, who was Czech, had left and had gone somewhere, and he was no longer, I'm mixing that story, aren't I? But anyway, she ended up having to drive the car herself. He waved her over to the driver's side, and so she took off. And the car behind her, with the flag car, was supposed to lead the cavalcade, so it pulled past her and took off. Very competitive Taurus. She didn't have any of that, so she gunned it and got back in front of him, and that was the way it went the rest of the way to West Germany. Is that the story you were after? Very, very, very typical of her.
She was recognized, obviously, because, you know, even though she was a grown woman, by this time she still had all of that same sweet face that we all saw in the movies. And she was recognized everywhere she went. She must have been, I was just saying, one of the most famous women in America, and I would not be surprised if she still is one of the most famous American women. But her experience in Prague attracted her very much to the ideas that were being raised by politicians there, Dubček in particular, and she was very concerned about them, and she followed everything that happened, and she got more and more involved. She set up her ambassadorial training program, which went on for quite a long time, a sort of something like what the Harvard Kennedy School does for beginning members of Congress. Anyway, she got ready for her career in diplomacy. And do you think it was that time in Prague that sent her on a diplomatic mission?
There's no question that the experience in 1968, she was sort of ripe for it. Always a hard worker from the ripe old age of 3. She had the value of hard work and as a satisfaction ingrained in her, and she was looking to make a difference in the world and in people's fortunes, and certainly the events, the Warsaw Pact invasion of Prague in '68, and her happening to be there, part of her charmed life, I guess, charmed invasion. She drew inspiration from that, and she very shortly found her way to the United Nations in 1969, and she had a lot of activity in the General Assembly, and then in the Stockholm Conference on the Environment. She built her career piece by piece, worked hard, did the ambassadorial seminar during the Reagan years, trained virtually every ambassador that went out to the world for those 8 years. She was a very hard worker. And when President Bush contacted her and suggested that he'd like her to be ambassador in Czechoslovakia, she was thrilled. And what a fortuitous time to have headed out to Prague and to Eastern Europe at this moment in history. And she had a very natural affinity for Václav Havel and for the other dissidents. They were instant friends. She, of course, had preceded herself as a little girl and was greatly endeared in Czechoslovakia during the previous visit in '68. A lot of people came up to her, and even later during the time of the communist domination of the state before the Velvet Revolution, people would come up and would surreptitiously show her or hand her their Shirley Temple fan club cards. Everybody knew her. Most of them had grown up with her, so they were very comfortable with her. She was another Shirlenka Vlakova. It was very simple, and but she was, as you suggested, a very tough adversary for the communists, and she was determined that she was going to find a way to support the dissidents and to support the movement and to bring down that piece of the Iron Curtain, and did so.
There's a story about her going to a demonstration.
Yes, she would instruct her staff at the embassy to go nowhere near it, and then she and my father would head on down. It was important for her. Many people saw her, not just the secret police, but many of the dissidents saw her and knew that she was there not just as a person, but she was looking and watching on behalf of the American people. This was, what was happening there was not going to go quietly.
So, Norm, what do you think of your period living in Paris?
Well, the most wonderful, one of the most wonderful parts of my period living in the palace was to be able to serve as the vessel for the fifth character in the book, my mother, a Czechoslovak Jewish Holocaust survivor, to be able to send her son back after having been deported to Auschwitz from Czechoslovakia by the same occupying regime, to send me back to live in a Jewish home that had once been occupied by those same forces, and to represent the most powerful and the most indispensable nation on earth, as you heard in my conversation with Bob and Steve earlier. That was a wonderful thing as a turn of history. I'll be uncharacteristically brief since we're going to go to a little Q&A when we finish. That was a wonderful turn of history, a wonderful transatlantic story, particularly when I discovered the swastikas under the tables. Alexandra and I looked at some of them when we were there together, to think that I was there and lighting the Sabbath candles on that same table. And I heard many of my mother's stories as a result that I had not before heard, as a result of my being there talking to her every day. And then I learned so many other wonderful stories, and I met my adopted book family here. Dan Berger, who I mentioned to all of you before, came and visited me, 4 or 5 times to help me begin excavating, and like a intellectual Monkey, he says, Norm, there's a larger story here. And part of that story was representing the values of liberal democracy. That was the third strand, fighting for those values. And as you'll read in the book, my mother emerged as my best advisor in guiding me as I fought for American values. At one point came very close to getting PNG'd, persona non grata, thrown out of the country because of my vigorous defense of LGBTQ rights. But it's all of a piece. As my mom pointed out to me in urging my advocacy, she said, do you think it is a coincidence that the Jews and the gays and the Roma, the gypsies, are still being targeted? I write in the book about, with her advice, how I fought for those 3 groups and others. We had a kosher iftar dinner in the palace. Others who are also being targeted. So those were 3 of the takeaways. And what a wonderful privilege when I left to start to put this book together and to work with everybody here on the stage in doing that, to capture those stories while people were still living. I was too late to talk to the twins, Rita and Ina. I was too late to talk to Vicky, but I still was able to talk to and befriend Eva. So we had one of the children who survived. And then, of course, I benefited from the memories, the experiences. Everybody on stage with me had a deep relationship with at least one person who lived in the palace, generally a child or a grandchild of the protagonist. So I benefited enormously from that.
Now, questions from the audience, but also if anybody on the panel. Thank you. If anybody on the panel wants to ask a question, we'll certainly honor that as well. So there's a hand right back there with the Wyatt Earp mustache.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, a retired member of the Foreign Service. There's been a lot in recent years about efforts strongly backed by the United States government to make restitution to owners of property, of Jewish property that had been occupied by the Nazis and later by the Soviets. I wonder if you could perhaps give us a little story about those efforts and what was the result of those as far as this building.
Well, everybody who's on the panel here had some role in the preservation and restitution of the building, and I write about it. It's an ongoing theme in the chapters. Ultimately, the surviving Petchek children did receive a settlement. It was set up by Ambassador Steinhardt, and the building was preserved. Unlike the first occupants who raided it, General Toussaint preserved the building, and he followed Mr. Pokorny's instructions. Pokorny wanted to keep everything where Otto Petchek had it, and the general went along with that. The building could not have been preserved without him. I think it's telling that of all the German occupiers in Prague, and I write candidly about his complicity on how, despite his resistance, he was drawn in to the evil of the regime. But he was the only one that they let live, the Czechs, when they put all the Germans on trial, because they had, and I have Czech documents of the time expressing gratitude for, among other things, his preservation of the building. And then, of course, Ambassador Black, Charlie's mom, began this modern push to preserve not just the building, to oversee the reparations, which were ultimately, after many decades, being set up first by Ambassador Steinhardt and then finally delivered on, but to also engage in the act of reparation and preservation of the memories, of the cultural, not just the physical heritage, but of the cultural heritage of the building. And I have a letter that Ambassador Black wrote to Eva Petchek saying, please tell me the story. It took me to come along to actually get the story. And I think I'll just end our panel and pass it back to Linda by thanking everybody here for their effort. Now, right or wrong, it's preserved between boards, so I'm already getting little notes for corrections to the to a future edition. They're minor, thankfully, minor corrections so far, but it's preserved now, and I want to thank everybody here for that, and of course thank all of you who have spent the morning with us, and now you're a part of this tradition of keeping these stories alive. And finally, Linda, since you can't thank yourself, I want to thank you for anchoring this fascinating panel. I learned some new things here today.
Well, I'm very impressed. Thank you very much. This has been a wonderful experience to hear from all of these people, and I hope that you all have enjoyed it. And keep in mind what a great resource Brookings is, that it provides us with all these opportunities. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.